My newer videos have been a lot more scientifically based than my previous ones, where I sort of talked about generic self-improvement habits, sleeping, bad habits, all that kind of stuff, meditation, you name it. But I wanted to make my newer videos a lot more authentic and talk about the things that interest me, such as science. But my previous viewers may not have understood some of the terminology that I used in these videos, such as metabolism, which I already did a video on that in the past. And now I'm going to do another video on enzymes, explaining exactly what an enzyme is. Because enzymes are known as biological catalysts that catalyze chemical reactions that happen inside of your body. They can basically make sure that those metabolic reactions and metabolism, if you haven't watched the other video, is the sum of all the chemical reactions inside of your body at any given time. It allows these chemical reactions to happen. And enzymes, while I could delve incredibly deep into this topic, into how an enzyme specifically works, I'm just going to go into the categories of enzymes, what you can sort of understand from what an enzyme's name is. That will help you to understand my video specifically just that little bit more when I'm sort of talking about different metabolic pathways where this chemical turns into this chemical, catalyzed by this enzyme. You'll be able to sort of understand how that reaction actually works a little bit more, which will just make those videos a little bit more interesting to you, and you'll be able to sort of get more knowledge and information out of it, rather than just sort of using those videos to mentally masturbate and procrastinate, etc., which is not what I want you to use my videos for. And the first category or class of enzyme that I'm going to talk about in this video is an oxidoreductase. Now this class includes a subclass of dehydrogenases and oxidases, and what these do is they transfer electrons from one molecule to another. I've talked about oxidases and dehydrogenases before. Alcohol dehydrogenase, squalene epoxidase, they're all either dehydrogenases or oxidases, and they're most commonly used inside of the electron transport chain to obviously transport electrons. But they can transport electrons between molecules. They transport like H plus ions, with an H plus ion, if you were sort of thinking about this more chemically, is essentially just a proton. Maybe I'll do a video soon on the sort of basics of chemistry, and so you can understand all the stuff that I'm talking about here a bit more. Science is one of the most complicated things. Everything kind of relates to each other in a weird sort of way. So you do have to know a lot of the foundations to be able to understand the more advanced stuff. But what it does is it transports electrons from one molecule to another, and that just means that it can end up turning into different molecules through things like H plus ions. I hope you kind of understand what I'm saying, but just know that when I sort of talk about dehydrogenases, oxidases, that's what it's doing. It's transporting an electron, maybe a few other things as well, from that molecule on the left to the molecule on the right. And the second category of enzymes that I'm going to talk about in this video is a transferase. And a transferase is a certain type of enzyme that transfers functional groups from one molecule to another. Now again, functional groups comes more into the sort of chemistry aspect of things, but I feel like I'll be able to explain this a bit better since functional groups is more organic chemistry, and that's personally what I like the most. A functional group is essentially what differentiates a molecule from another molecule. There are certain functional groups like a carbon-carbon double bond, a carboxyl group, a phosphate group, amine, ketone, aldehyde. All of these are specific functional groups. Esters even, all these are specific functional groups. They have specific symbols and stuff. I'll probably put them all up on screen or whatever so you can understand it a bit more. But they will transfer functional groups from one molecule to another. Now, the main functional group that is sort of involved in metabolic pathways is phosphate, a phosphate group, PO4, and that's with the two oxygen atoms being an ion. Normally, they would have a hydrogen atom attached to that oxygen atom to make it sort of stable and not charged and not ready to react with something else. But a kinase is the specific type of enzyme that transfers a phosphate group from one molecule to another molecule, or it just adds a phosphate group straight up from wherever it's got that phosphate group from. Maybe it's just circulating around the bloodstream into another molecule. And a kinase can also remove phosphate groups from molecules. It can do all sorts of stuff to do with phosphates. And there are other enzymes in the sort of kinase category, as well as other enzymes that remove things like methyl groups, carbon-carbon double bonds. Now, the third category of enzyme that I'm going to talk about in today's video is something known as a hydrolase. Hydrolases, that's the category. A hydrolase is the sort of specific type of enzyme, and a hydrolase is something that uses water to break down a molecule. And this is a good example of how starch, which is known as a complex carbohydrate made up of glucose monomers, it uses hydrolase enzymes to break down starch into glucose. With every single sort of starchy chain that's put into the enzyme, it uses water molecules to break apart the bonds between the glucose molecules, and that means that it can contribute to blood sugar. It will then get absorbed into the bloodstream through the gut lining, and then it can contribute to the things that glucose does inside of the body. It also applies to things like lipases, proteases, of which there are many specific types of those enzymes. There are a lot of different types of proteases, there are a lot of different types of lipases, but these are mostly the things that digest food groups almost immediately as they enter the body. They use water, one of the most abundant chemicals inside of our body, to actually break down those molecules. Now, the fourth category of enzyme that I'm going to talk about in this video is something known as a lyase. Now, a lyase involves double bonds. Now, a double bond, it's a complicated thing. When referring to chemistry, it just means that they share two pairs of electrons. I'll show that up on screen so you can understand it a bit more. But a double bond, it's a lot stronger and a lot less stable than a single bond. And a lyase ends up splitting these things in half. Many functional groups contain double bonds. Carboxyl functional groups contain a double bond. An ethene group contains a double bond. In fact, an ethene group is literally just a carbon-carbon double bond. But a lyase will deal with these double bonds when it comes to sort of having to break them apart to make other types of molecules and all that sort of stuff. A decarboxyl enzyme will break off the sort of oxygen-carbon double bond that is present in a carboxyl group, and the aldolase enzyme will break apart a carbon-carbon double bond that is present inside a molecule that may need to be changed. Now, the fifth category of enzyme that I'm going to talk about in this video is something known as a ligase. Now, a ligase is something that contributes to the protein synthesis thing, the protein synthesis process, which is actually the thing that gives your body the ability to make enzymes. I'll probably do a video on things like gene expression, protein synthesis in the future, because it is quite an interesting thing. It is quite a nice, logical, pattern-based process, which might interest you, but maybe that's something for the future. You just have to know that when you maybe look at one of my videos and you see an enzyme that has the suffix synthase, that is probably a type of ligase enzyme that just means that something can be made from two different molecules. Now, the sixth and final category of enzyme that I'm going to talk about in this video, there probably are a few more, but more often than not, certain types of categories can sort of come under these things. I mean, when I sort of did my research, I couldn't find the category of enzyme kinase on my research, and I was really confused because this was one of the enzymes that I was most familiar with when sort of doing my metabolic pathway processes. But then, after doing a bit more research, I realized that a kinase came under a transferase enzyme, and that sort of made so much more sense. So when you sort of see an enzyme, more often than not, it will come under one of these six categories. But the sixth category is an isomerase enzyme, and these can include obviously enzymes that sort of end in isomerase or end in mutase. But instead of sort of adding or removing functional groups, these often move functional groups, because the definition of what an isomer actually is two different and structurally different molecules, but they have the same chemical and molecular formula. I'll sort of explain that on the screen, but it will move the functional group to a different position on the molecule, and that makes it act differently, means that it can be involved in separate metabolic pathways, but that's just what an isomerase essentially does. Now, that is all six categories of enzymes, but I probably will make a video on each of the sort of subclasses, going into a bit more detail on what they do and how they work. I'll probably do a video on kinases, how they work, etc. Maybe I'll do a video on a protease, carbohydrates, lipase, dehydrogenase, all the sort of subclasses that sort of come under the groups like transferase, oxidoreductase, all that sort of stuff. I'll go through the specific subclasses, some examples, how they're used in reactions, what they do, and maybe you'll find that quite interesting to expand your knowledge on human anatomy and biology in general. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also recommend subscribing because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.